All right, so now we're coming to the very last phase of the mix here. Basically, once I've got everything working, I've built my mix from the ground up, I like to hear everything together and then start making the determinations for where everything really needs to go at the very end. So I'm going to play this and I'm going to start explaining a couple of ideas.
Practice shooting straight, don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers if they're stranger than you.
So everything's nice, everything is well balanced, everything's well defined, but it could use a little bit more attitude. And so this is the point where once everything's good and balanced and fitting together and working in all the ways that we like, we can then start to make things a little bit disproportionate and a little bit overly aggressive, or put in the vibe and the kind of that sort of unrestricted sense of energy and musicality that doesn't necessarily play by the rules. So listening to it, I feel like there's a little chunk of space that's right in between maybe about 100 and 200 hertz in that first bass range, where the bass guitar itself could be a lot more aggressive and more forward. And then the kick could have a little bit more bottom to make the mix a little bit more aggressive. Now that I've got the claps in, I think that the snare could come forward a little bit, and the vocal could have a little bit more aggression to it as well.
Practice shooting straight, don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down.
So I'm going to start with the snare because that's the easiest one. I'm literally just going to turn it up, and I think that's going to solve that issue.
Practice shooting straight, don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down.
Cool. Next thing is the kick. I'm going to use this kick layer here and turn that up.
Practice shooting straight, don't forget to lock the game.
And you hear how that like lower sub kick reinforces the stomp that's in here? That's an important part of that. I'm using just the thump of the kick, basically, that layer that we tucked in, so that it all supports and everything comes together. So, you know, the kick and the stomp are not really fighting each other.
Practice shooting straight, don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down.
I do think that the snare could have a little bit more lower mid energy. I think that's part of the reason it's not cutting through.
Don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers if they're stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down.
Cool. Like that. Now let's get the vocal to kind of poke forward. Well, actually, let's start with the guitars because that might be a little bit easier. So we have them panned in sort of 50-50 here. I think we can just go all the way out.
Don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down.
Or maybe just in a touch.
Don't forget to lock the game. Don't look.
And then the overheads can come in quite a bit, actually. We're going to make a tighter kind of overhead sound.
Don't forget to lock the game.
It's changing the compression. Let's do it from the actual bus. Yeah, there we go.
Don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down.
And you'll notice in doing that, the snare really came forward a lot because as it's starting to go into mono, the pan laws are actually boosting the center tones or the center elements. So we can go back to the snare, make a little adjustment. It's a lot of this process of kind of going back and forth ever so slightly.
Don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers.
All right, let's really get the guitar to come forward. So I think, you know, we talked about it before, but I think it can definitely have more grab to it, and I think it could also have a little bit more of the actual texture of the guitar. So I'm going to use a really unique EQ. It's a linear phase EQ for one, which makes it a little bit unique, but it also has certain interesting sort of twists on tonality because it has a second and third EQ. The second one is a front to back EQ. It doesn't exactly change tone in terms of proportion, it changes tone in terms of apparent depth. And when you hear it, you'll see what I mean. And then the other one, which is called the entropy EQ, is a texture EQ. It sort of figures out the non-harmonic content and allows you to adjust that, which is like really unique and really cool. So that's the entropy EQ. You can hear it's doing something really weird. It's taking all the non-harmonic stuff and boosting it and turning down all the harmonic stuff. All right, let's get the bass nice and forward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the bass track. I'm going to really hone in on that first primary bass octave. Cool. So maybe just a little bit more. Let me open up the filter a touch. Cool. And now I'm going to take my stock DigiDesign Lo-Fi, which is one of my favorite little in-the-box distortions. I'm going to crank the saturation. And I'll start bringing up the distortion as well. I'm going to tuck that down. And you can hear when I bring it in, it makes it growlier and it focuses the tone right in on that primary octave. Now, we lose a little bit of the sense of the low end of the bass, but when I bring it into the mix, it's going to really cut through and feel much more powerful. So in solo, here's the before and after. And here it is in the mix. I think actually the bass can just come up in general. And one thing I like to do whenever I'm doing parallel processing is just to see what happens, switch into linear phase, because the linear phase is going to retain a more natural phase relationship with the parallel channel, or the main channel in this case, and so we're not going to lose any sense of the low end at all when I have it in linear phase mode, but sometimes it can become a little bit overbearing, so let's find out how it sounds.
Don't forget to lock the gate. Don't look back or slow.
You hear how the bass sounds like massive now, so I think I'm going to keep it in linear phase mode for this particular. Sometimes it works better in natural phase or minimal phase mode though, and I'm going to just tuck this down until it feels about right.
The stranger isn't there, stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down. Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers if they're stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down.
And a little dab will do you once you really get it right. Like you can see I've got this turned down to like -20.
Out of the stranger isn't there, stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down. Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers.
So with the acoustic and the dobro, I want to add just a little bit of 1K to help it cut and feel like it's powerful. Like in solo it sounds fine, but once everything else is in, we lose a little bit of the presence of it, and I'm not talking about a whole huge amount here. I'm talking about just a little bit.
Shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow. Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow down.
Actually, it is still sort of getting lost a little bit, so I'm going to turn it back down a touch.
Shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look down. Don't make friends out of the strangers if they.
One thing that's worth noting is that it's not always worth it to try and unmask something. So yeah, the guitars are masking the acoustic and the dobro a little bit, but it feels really full, and so I would be hesitant to try to work things around, you know, taking tone out of the guitar and stuff like that in order to get the acoustic and the dobro to poke through.
Shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow down. Friends out of the strangers.
Actually, I'm pretty happy just turning it up a little bit. Okay, let's get these vocals going. So for the vocals, I'm going to add a little bit of parallel compression. The parallel compression is not just meant to be compression in the normal sense, but it's also meant to sort of be a little bit of distortion. The distortion is... it's going to help it have character, it's going to help it cut, it's going to help it feel thicker and fuller. So what I'm doing is I'm setting this up on an aux, and I have a second aux going here. So this is going to be my lead, and this is going to be my parallel. And for the parallel channel, I really like using a very, very aggressive compressor. The 1176 is usually the natural go-to choice, but as of recently, I've been using the JST gain reduction plugin.
Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back 'cause
And it's important to notice that this gain knob is not linear. It will change the tone of the signal. And so what I want to do is I want to push the gain up and then pull the overall level back.
don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back 'cause slow down.
Yeah. And then once I start to hear that kind of mid-range bloom happening, that's when I'll turn up the body control.
Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back 'cause slow down.
And then I'm going to pull this in, tuck this way down, and start bringing it in the context of the mix.
Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back 'cause slow down.
Before,
Strangers, they're stranger than you.
after.
Strangers, they're stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down.
And one of the things I find is that because the tone changes so much, there's no rule against EQing the parallel return, and we can do it again using either a minimal phase or a linear phase and just go for whatever sounds best to our ear.
The strangers, if they're stranger than you.
So the tone is getting really focused into that very bright top of the nose, bridge of the nose kind of tone. I'm going to grab an EQ, and it's probably right around 2K.
The strangers, if they're stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down. The strangers, if they're stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down. The strangers, if they're stranger than you. The strangers, if they're stranger than you. The strangers, if they're stranger than you.
And you can hear that by doing this bit of EQ, it makes the vocal feel overall taller. It doesn't really vastly change the tonality. Like, we do hear a little bit of that extra brightness because I do have this big boost going on, which I'm going to back off a little bit.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate.
And now I'm going to switch into linear phase.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate.
You can hear that that's a much fuller sound. It's also not quite as dimensional, so sometimes we want something that's more dimensional, sometimes we want something that's fuller. I tend to default to whatever the mix calls for, so here it is in natural phase mode.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow.
So no EQ.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate.
EQ.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate.
Linear phase EQ.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow down.
So I like the linear phase EQ, I just want to make a few adjustments to it because it's getting to be a little bit too much. It's a bit overwhelming. So I'm going to back off the top end boost. I'm going to back off the mid-range cut. And I'm going to back off ever so slightly the bottom end boost.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate.
And then I'm actually going to back off the parallel return overall.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers if they're stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down. Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate.
Cool, so we have a much more aggressive, much more full-sounding mix already. Really didn't take that much to get there. And there is one other finishing touch that I tend to like to do, and it's a very nuanced and particular program that I use. It's called Pi. It's by a company called SoundRadix, and it's really cool. It's this variable all-pass thing. It basically makes sure that everything stays in the best phase relationship that it can, and I tend to throw it on a lot of stuff. So I've now placed it on every channel except for the lead vocal. I'm going to put it on the lead vocal in a second, but it tends to be a little hit or miss on lead vocals, I find. But what I'm going to do, it has this sort of global bypass function, and I'm going to bypass bring it in so you can hear what's going on. Before.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow down.
It's kind of cool. I'm going to take it off, and then I'm going to bring it back on while we're playing so you can really hear the difference between how everything kind of sits together.
Practice shooting straight. Don't forget to lock the gate. And don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers if they're stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down.
Like, it really brings the transients to life. It really brings the low end to life. It's a cool little plug-in, and what it does is sort of not easily replaceable. I'm gonna put it on the lead vocal, and you'll see what I mean about how it's kind of particular with vocals. So before.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game.
After.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game. And don't look back or slow down.
So it's in the instruments, it's not as noticeable, but in the vocal, I feel like I can hear it a little more clearly. It can get a little bit phasey. In this particular instance, it seems to be playing pretty well with the overall sound.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game.
And the other thing is that I have this channel weight, which I can turn up to really kind of preserve the vocal a little more.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game. And don't look back or slow down.
But ultimately, I think in this case, I still kind of prefer it without.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game. And don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the stranger.
Cool. So once everything is all sitting together, I've got my effects on the way that I like it. Then the very, very last step is for me to put on a bit of bus compression and EQ just to kind of really bring the whole thing home. Now, a lot of people will mix into their compressor. I go back and forth between that idea and the idea that the compressor is set up at the end. And the pros and cons are this. If you set up your compressor right from the start and you mix into it, you're going to end up with really great results. Sometimes I don't know what I want the compressor to really do until I get closer to the end of the mix. So in this particular case, what I'm really thinking is that the compressor should be kind of giving a little bit of tension to the overall sound, a little bit of extra pull to everything. And so I'm going to be using maybe a slightly slower release than I'm used to using, and I might be using a slightly faster attack. Normally I use a very, very slow attack and a pretty darn quick release. This is going to be a little bit more on the medium because I want the effect of the compressor to really translate.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game. And don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers if they're stranger than you.
So that sounds like it's hitting the right amount of the record. It's just obviously like way too pumpy and squashing the heck out of the transients and just really not that fun at the end of the day. I'm going to get the release timing right. I think we're going to go probably about 12 o'clock, but we'll see.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game. And don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers if they're stranger than you. And don't.
That actually feels about right. So I want to show the difference in, like, I mean, this is all toward the fast side, but it's so radically different when it's set all the way to the left versus when it's set here. I just want to before and after that real quick.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game. Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game. And don't look back or slow.
Right, like once I slow it down just enough, you can really hear the swing of the compressor, and it leaves kind of this space in the middle. Now, if you want something that's very forward and very in your face, this works against you. But for something that has that kind of pulling groove that you're trying to bring out, this is actually a really great technique for doing that. So I'm trading a little bit of like playback level at the end of the day for a little bit more feel. And that's an important thing to, be aware of when setting a bus compressor, which is like, okay, am I okay with the overall playback level being maybe not quite 100% as loud as it would normally be, but it's going to groove better? Yeah, I would think that the groove is usually going to sell the song a little better. All right, so anyway, now let's set the attack. Normally, I would be turning the attack like to there.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game.
So all the transients just getting right through. In this case, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to slow it down because I want to hear the transient round out just a little bit.
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock the game. And don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers.
So here we hear it gets like totally papery, right?
Practice holding straight. Don't forget to lock.
It's like the whole record is dipping out every time a kick or a snare hits. Here, not so much.
Practice holding straight, don't
I'm thinking right about here is probably good.
practice holding straight, don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow.
Like, it's doing something kind of cool to the clap in particular. It's like allowing the sort of ridgy quality and texture of the clap to sort of jump through. That's just a freak accident. I don't know why that's happening. But having it set like this, I feel like I'm catching just a little bit of the transient. It's audible to the ear that the transient's being grabbed, but it's not really choking it in any way. So now the next step is going to be to turn the ratio down because this is obviously way too much compression.
Practice holding straight, don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down.
And I'm also going to engage the high-pass filter because I want the kick to kind of step out of the speaker a little bit more.
Practice holding straight, don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down. Don't make
Yeah, I dig that. All right, so let's before and after that real quick.
practice holding straight, don't forget to lock the game. Practice holding straight, don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down.
Right, so it makes it a little smaller, but it gives it a little bit of extra groove and a little bit of extra glue and kind of gives a vibe to it as well. Also, we can turn up the makeup gain a little bit because we are doing maybe about a dB of compression here.
Practice holding straight, don't forget to lock the game. Don't look back or slow down. Don't make friends out of the strangers if they're stranger than you. And don't look back or slow down. Practice holding straight, don't forget.
So obviously that was a pretty quick run through of how I approach the final stages of a mix. This process for me would probably take about an hour to an hour and a half because I just want to go through and make sure that everything's right, and also there's certainly some elements that I haven't brought in for the sake of this tutorial yet. But I think it's really important to just go over that process. And in this next section that I'm about to do, I'm just going to recap some of the things that I did and talk about some various other little tips, techniques, some stuff that didn't necessarily apply to this mix, just to round everything out, give you a comprehensive look at the advanced world of mixing. And ultimately, the advanced world of mixing isn't so much about advanced techniques, things that are like, you know, Legends of the Hidden Temple scrolls and stuff like that. It's more the very last 5% that goes into separating a good mix from a great mix, which sometimes involves really weirdo techniques that are kind of unheard of, like what I was doing with the mid-side thing, or sometimes it's just solid decision making, you know, being aware of what your style is calling for, being aware of what you're trying to get your bus compressor to do, which is in its own way advanced, even though there's nothing advanced about setting a compressor. You know, being aware that it's like, okay, I'm trying to create a sense of pull and groove and glue, and I don't need things to be necessarily super forward if groove is going to take precedence, that kind of stuff. So, okay, let's move on to the next section.